Guten Tag, mein Name ist Clara Mavella und ich leite.
Hello, I'm Clara Marveglia, and I head the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute in Berlin. Today we're at the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and my guest is Dr. Christine Kurmeyer, who is the Women's and Equality Officer here. Welcome, Ms. Kurmeyer. Good to see you, Dr. Kurmeyer. The best thing's always when people present themselves, because you know exactly what you want to talk about. Yes, I'm happy to do that. Since 2006, I've been the Central Women's and Equality Officer at the Charité, which is the University Teaching Hospital here in Berlin. I've been in this post in various different places, and at the same time, I have carried out some other activities too. But this particular post, as Central Women's and Equality Officer, that's always been my main profession. I did work earlier in equality at Hanover University. I began working in the equality office there and headed it up. After my studies, I started doing this work. I studied social psychology. That was in Hanover too. And I worked in social sciences, where I did research on the impact of the 4-day week on the families of workers at Volkswagen, and then I worked in the unit which was advising people suffering from bullying and harassment, and I also carried out training for managers. All of that led to me getting this job here at the Teaching Hospital in Berlin, doing something which relates back to what I did before I went to university. I trained as a nurse, and I can bring that experience into my work as well. And that is quite productive. So I know how a hospital works. I understand the procedures, how the wards function, how you deal with patients. I can work with doctors and with nurses too. I'm familiar with all this from my own training. But of course also the work of academics, because a teaching hospital is also associated with a faculty, with all the usual university governance bodies, and that's one of my main focuses here as Women's and Equality Officer. Just to give you some insight as to what the work involves day to day, there's a lot of advice involved. For example, this morning I got a phone call about a contractual situation a woman found herself in. She's had a baby and she has a grant and she needs to know what happens now. Does she go on maternity leave and then parental leave if she's on the grant? These are issues that are affected, but also organising discussions here at the university. Yesterday, for example, we had one of these discussion sessions where we talked about conducting operations when you're pregnant. So if a doctor becomes pregnant but is continuing the practical part of their training and needs to carry out operations, normally you couldn't do that under our maternity law, but times have changed and women want to carry on completing their practical training even when they're pregnant. So we talked about what actually is necessary to make that possible. What are the pros and the cons of continuing to do these operations? And these are always really stimulating discussions, which mean that women here at the Charité get to know each other better and establish networks. Their own little personal network, perhaps, where they can exchange with colleagues and seek advice from others or offer advice. These are the active parts of the work. But of course, a lot of committee work is involved as well. If you are a Women's and Equality Officer, you're involved in every appointment procedure, for example, for professors at the university. You have to play your part in that. And we now have a situation at the Charité where we have succeeded in insisting that when people apply for a professorship here at Charité, every applicant needs to hand in a written paper on how they intend to promote women and equality when they get the job. we've been doing that since 2015. And we've now conducted the first interviews with people who have been appointed here as professors, and after a year in their new job, they get a phone call from us here in the Equality Office so that we can go and talk to them and say, okay, how have you been implementing that written blueprint that you sent us when you took your appointment? There were a lot of reservations about this to begin with, but really what this is about is making sure that we encourage awareness, but also offer support in this specific field of activity, so that as Women's and Equality Officer, I can offer information, I can offer help and so forth. Sounds great. But you also began that initiative called Dual Career, which is based around an association, and that is supplementary, if you like, to what you're doing, because when people have a family, they don't really want to be commuting over long distances. Yes, Dual Career is addressing an increasingly urgent issue when we appoint executives or professors. Not just men want to bring their partners when they get a new job. If you compare it with the old days, people's partners want to continue with their own careers. So when we have women professors, because we want to appoint women as professors too, we also want to be able to offer something to the men who are married to or living with those women. And the women professors are in a rather different situation often compared with the men who are professors. The women aren't necessarily living with somebody who's prepared to do a skilled worker level job. That used to be much more the case in the old days. It isn't so much these days. But the old classic constellation was the man would be the professor and the woman would be, say, a primary school teacher. That was quite common. But when the professor is a woman, they are not very often married to primary school teachers. They tend to be associated with people doing a similar level of work, if not a higher level of work. For example, the woman might be appointed to a W2 professorship, but they're married to someone who already has a W3, that is a scale higher. And that's difficult because we can't create a job for a W3 professor. That would mean changing the structures. That would mean paying quite different amounts of money or resources. And of course, there's resistance to that. So the original dual career idea was we appoint the professor, man, and maybe we find a job somewhere in the university, in the laboratory or somewhere for his wife. And that is relatively cheap to do, let's say. But when we appoint a woman as a professor, it's not so easy to find, for example, a high-scale professorship for her husband or partner, because that would affect our academic structures. So dual career advice is primarily focused on supporting people in their own search for a new career opportunity here in Berlin, which is hard enough. And what I'm doing at the moment is working with my colleagues to draw up a new strategy for a way we might do this. In 2011-2012, we set up the Dual Career Network in Berlin, and this is now based with Berlin partners, because it's important to have those business contacts that they have, because not many couples these days work in the same department. They may not even both be working in academia. There are a lot of mixed couples, one working in academic life and one in business, say, or industry. So it's useful to have a network of contacts. The first task for a dual career service center would be to build those contacts for people in managerial or executive positions. For example, go to Siemens, which is a big company, organize a personal discussion in order to build bridges for people arriving here. And we thought that if we can do this around a network, we should also be offering some kind of seed financing. But for that, we have to talk to the various organizations involved because we need money to do that. But we think it's absolutely essential because otherwise all these measures will turn out not to bear fruit. Would you comment on the fact that you've been working in this field for a long time? What do you say about those who doubt the benefits of promoting women? A lot of people say it's still a male system. Yes, that's quite an interesting question, because of course we've been considering these questions for a long time, and promoting women in the classical sense was often regarded as compensation for a deficit, because you had to start thinking about what's involved here. Gender studies weren't as widespread as they fortunately are today. Now we've moved on from that deficit compensation paradigm for promoting women, and we've developed some different strategies. A very good example is mentoring programs for women in Germany, especially at the universities, since the late 1990s. And the idea there is that women can develop their own managerial style with the help of seminars and these networks, especially for women in academic life. So they address questions like, what kind of a workplace do I need if I'm going to enjoy managing? And that can throw up some quite new concepts. I think also, in the meantime, we've achieved a kind of critical mass. We now have 20% of professors who are women here in the Charité. In Berlin, at all the universities, that is 30% women. That's quite a few, which means we can think in new ways about how to design a professorship so that women can enjoy bringing their own specific socialization, which is not so competition-based, but more geared towards cooperation. How can we design the position of the professor so that the woman is taken seriously, but nevertheless we can move away from this rather male-moulded and male-dominated system? It's going to take some time, but there are some simple statistics. For example, it's 600 years ago that we invented universities here in Germany, and it's only for the last 100 years that women have been allowed to study. So to change that system, we simply need a lot more opportunities to get to know and understand the system and then go into depth and try to change things. But I'm confident that we will continue. That's fantastic. A big problem here has always been that the first studies were published in the 70s about feminist linguistics, this generic male form whereby women are kind of absorbed into the male form in languages. That certainly is in most countries, certainly where there is a patriarchal system. But it's important that in all academic manifestations, content is expressed in a male way. Whether we're talking about medicine, that's one thing, but also when we talk about refugees, we use the male form in German, but women tend to have a more severe experience as refugees. But you've set up a project for women refugees last year. Do you want to talk about that? Yes, I'm happy to do that, because that's a project that I am really personally very fond of. And we're doing this together with Berlin's Women's Council. In 2015, before anyone talked about this refugee crisis, we were thinking about the fact that the media talk a lot about refugees and they show men mostly in the pictures. And we thought, well, what about the women? We don't want to talk about people, we want to talk to people. And so we set up what was at the time the only association that was devoted to helping women in exile. And we invited them along to the Women's Council here in the state of Berlin and asked, what do you need? What's your problem? And of course, women tend to be responsible for children. Most women in exile have children, which means it's harder for them to take part in the integration courses or the German language courses. They have less mobility, which means also they have limited access to the health system. And it was at that point that I thought, here in the Charité, we have very committed doctors, men and women, who possibly could get involved here. And how can we design it so that we reach out to those women with limited mobility? And it seemed fairly obvious that we need to go out there and meet the women in their shelters, in their hostels. And how can we reach out specifically to women? Because it's not enough to say we're going to do health education. If we did it only for women, people would say, why aren't you offering it to men? So we are offering discussions about gynecological issues. And that's why we call the project Women for Women, because there are only women involved. A gynecologist, for example, a woman will hold a short talk and talk about how the health system works in Berlin. We have women as interpreters, and we have female academics who, after the discussions, hand out questionnaires and talk to the women on a one-to-one basis, because there wasn't much information available before about who the women are who are coming to Germany, what level of education do they have, what career experience do they have. Many of them only worked in the service sector without a certificate stating that they have, say, training as a business clerk. They might even have been running a little business or working as a midwife, but they don't have documentation, they didn't complete a regulated training course. But nobody knew about this before. And now, since 2015, we've been to 40 refugee homes and spoken to more than 300 women and have asked them about their background and what they would like and what they hope for here in Germany. So we have some pretty unique data, and we've been able to recognize quite a lot of factors and understand that it's particularly hard for women because there's a lot of discrimination. A lot of women coming from Syria or Afghanistan are wearing a headscarf, and they tend to get approached about that on the streets. Also, there's a trend for the women in the refugee homes to start wearing the headscarf more as a protective measure. So these are self-reinforcing effects which lead to women continuing to have difficulty integrating into society. But at the same time, that's what the women want. They very much want to take part in training, to get a job, so that they can feed their families. And they do recognize the chance to live differently here in Germany compared with their home countries, where very often they did suffer from patriarchal conditions, especially bearing in mind the conditions they see here. They're particularly aware of that. So it's quite painful if there are children back in the home country or other members of the family. These women are very torn emotionally. On the one hand, they are here in Germany with all its conveniences of an emancipated society, which they can benefit from. But at the same time, they have to leave their home, and that is a bond which is not so easily cast aside. So what we try to do is to develop and present a differentiated picture of who refugees are. We say there isn't such a thing as the refugee woman. Everyone has their own unique story. And because of the experience that we've gained here in Berlin, we set up the round table for women in exile here in Germany. Since September 2016, I've regularly been convening a round table for people who work with these women as well, above all for women refugees here in Berlin. And we meet and we exchange information about all the many little initiatives and projects they are that have been set up specifically for refugee women. But as you so often have in Berlin, on the one side there's a lot on offer, and on the other side there are the refugee women, but it's difficult to bring them together for the reasons I've described, because the women aren't as mobile and they can't simply go out in the evening. So through the round table, we try to pass on information about these projects on offer, to build networks and to have a closely meshed network for women. You mentioned the Women's Council here in the state of Berlin, and I wanted to congratulate you because in September you've been chairing it. Would you like to tell us a bit about what the Women's Council does? Yes, the Berlin Women's Council is a very venerable institution. If you like, it's an umbrella organization for all the associations and groups and campaigns and projects which are specifically dedicated to women's issues. That can range from associations with a religious background, for example, the Catholic Housewives Association, or it can be a quite overarching association. We offer a monthly plenary for delegates from these many different institutions and associations. And we also formulate position papers. We have a Facebook page. We're trying to be the voice of Berlin's women. We're trying to cluster that and reinforce it. And with the new executive board, because I wasn't the only one to be newly elected, the entire executive board has been newly elected. And in September we got together, all these new people, and we're pretty confident now that working together we'll be able to define a few milestones and move forward. For example, on the headscarf, we organized a plenary session where we asked the spokesperson to come along from the Ibn Rushd Goethe Mosque, which was set up by Seren Atesh, the liberal mosque, to ask about the headscarf. What's the tradition behind the headscarf here? Is it really true that all Muslim women have to wear the headscarf? And apparently it turns out that actually that's not the case. It's more the result of male patriarchy that has led to this belief you can be a Muslima and not wear a headscarf. It was a very interesting discussion and a lot of women were present. And we're trying to continue along these lines. We had our first event with the senator responsible for integration, employment and social affairs, and we asked her about her position on women refugees in Berlin. And what about the prospects? How can we develop this? How can the Senate of Berlin follow this up when women leave the shelters and start to be given their own accommodation? And that's quite interesting. These are some of the things. It shows that we're on the right road with some of the plans we've forged for the next 3 years. And we hope that the Women's Council can reach a broader public. Look forward to that. These days in Europe they say that women have achieved everything they need. I wanted to ask you, why is it so important that women's rights and feminism remain on the agenda? Very important, yes, because of course we haven't yet achieved equality. This is a hypothesis that right-wing parties like to present, but if I just look to see, for example, the distribution of managerial positions across gender, I don't think we've achieved it. It can't just be the case that women don't want to do this, which is a favorite argument, but the biographies that define women's careers are still being set by men, and that has to change. Also, I come from a tradition of project management, and I firmly believe that only mixed teams are really successful. There are other studies which have demonstrated this, not just Kienbaum or McKenzie. It's important that we have these mixed teams in management so that every aspect can be covered. And there are different perspectives on life because women and men are socialized in different ways. They've experienced different things, and it's important to have both these perspectives on life represented in management, in managing other people. So for me, equality is still a long way removed. There's a lot to do still, but we are now seeing a shift to the right in Europe. The right-wing populists are on the advance, unfortunately. Unfortunately, even Marine Le Pen in France, as a woman, is fighting feminism, which I think is quite tragic. Not every woman is automatically feminist, and not every man is automatically a macho. So, from that point of view, on both sides, there are advocates of this movement. To me, it's clear that promoting equality, which is reflected in feminist thesis, is essential for our future. If we don't start taking account of people's different life situations and drawing consequences from that for education as a whole, for the distribution of labour, the distribution of work, that is housework and gainful employment, if we don't develop mutual understanding on both sides, this business as usual in Europe will not progress us. There are examples where women's rights are being undermined again, like in Poland or Russia, indeed. So a right isn't safe even once you've got it. On the 9th of May in Berlin, there's going to be a big women's march. In fact, a European march. Will you be marching? Of course. This is one opportunity in a manner that draws in all the parties and the broad political spectrum to send out a message that women need to commit if they don't want to lose their rights. And that's something that I always say to women in any networks I'm in, that's the Women's Council, but also the Women's Conference of Women's Officers at Universities. We all share this view that we have to do more. We have to go out onto the streets. We have to be more public about this and say there are principles, there are basic rights here in Europe which are at risk. And we need to articulate that fact. Otherwise, we won't be heard. And this is one opportunity, this march on the 9th of May next year, to take a stance and to express this in physical form. Let's come on to theory now. One classic, I think it was in the late 40s, 1949, was the work by Simone de Beauvoir on the second sex. You've also written a doctorate about this topic, and you have a theory. Do you want to talk about it? Yes. The basis for the doctoral dissertation that I wrote about mentoring for women had a subtitle which was Professionalism, New Departures for Professionalism, Female Professionalism basically. And it talked a lot about the gender-specific segregation of the labor market. Based on industrialization processes in the mid-19th century here in Germany, these spheres of work were divided so that you had work in the home and gainful employment in industry. That was separated out, and that reflected also stereotypical roles ascribed to the genders long before industrialization happened. And in psychoanalysis, there is a description of socialization, of individuation, which relates to gender identity. So that even as small children, every human being taking shape decides, okay, I'm male or female, which means I'm going to be like mummy or I'm going to be like daddy. And in our social sphere, women are the first point of reference and usually the most important. And usually they are the first love object. There is a particularly close emotional bond with the mother. So this identification with the mother is very dominant. So little girls can identify with their mother. They can say, okay, I'm going to be like mummy. It brings its own conflicts, of course, but little boys establish that they're not going to be like mummy. And then there is not much on offer for them in terms of role models, which they can reach out to and draw on, because absent fathers, we know, have been a major factor. So very often little boys have to develop their own ex negativo image of what they are working towards. And that can lead to a situation, if mummy's nice and kind, then if I am a bloke, I have to be a bit rough, a bit impolite and quite unpleasant. Because of this dichotomy, I can't be like mummy, so I have to be different. And that can lead to this kind of machista behavior. And it's also a kind of hurt. I can't be like mummy, and I don't have any guidance here for how to be, which can lead to an excessive masculinity, cultivating a differentness which promotes competition and difference. But this gender-specific labour market segregation, of course, individuation will be more individual, but the demands that society places on each individual is, from the outset, gender-specific. There are some well-known studies about this. For example, the one about the child, the baby in the pram, and the adults behave differently when they're told it's a little girl and when they're told it's a little boy. So this stereotyping of gender roles is difficult to avoid because it is reflected in so many everyday situations. The classic one, of course, is television as a medium, which of course plays a big part in our roles, where these gender stereotypes are reinforced. So it's important, first of all, to develop an understanding for the genesis of these stereotypes around gender in order to find a way out of this. So you might think, well, if every individual replicates this, then it's going to carry on in perpetuity, but that's not the case. We have a trend now that young men, quite consciously, are wanting to be fathers and have a different relationship with their children and take a step away from that gender stereotyping. And these are things that we need to support more. Supporting women to take managerial or leadership roles and to define their workplace differently, not competition-based, but cooperation-based, and supporting men who take this bold step into the family. That's why here at the Charité we have paternity officers or fatherhood officers that people can seek advice from If, for example, a man wants to explain to his line manager that he wants to take 6 months off to look after his kids. So these are complementary processes, and I think in the longer term there will be a greater balance, and that's why we're not just called women's officers. Of course we are women's officers because we want to support women, but we're also equality officers because what it's really about is establishing that equilibrium between the forces to offer women access to leadership positions, but also to offer men access to families again. In the world of business and industry, which you mentioned before, if women are not represented in management, it seems that companies stand to lose a lot of profit. There was a recent ranking at the World Economic Forum which came up with a very high figure. I think it was 25% of profit is lost because there are no women in management. So the fact that these stereotypes are supported with pinkification, for example, it's nearly Christmas, and all those toys that are being sold with different versions made for boys and girls in different colours. That's crazy. So pinkification is the one thing, but Lufthansa, the airline, for example, Lufthansa has Women's World with a shopping queen and a special credit card for women. This is a trend that really needs to be halted. What can be done about that? I mean, with business. I do think it's important to talk to business, but it always means that one must have an ability to understand business mechanisms and accept them. You have to do your sums and explain that you lose profit if you don't have women in management. That's a typical business mechanism. It's not enough to say there are no innovative ideas if you don't have mixed teams. You have to express the business case. I have my reservations about that, but I don't have any problems arguing in those terms. What's more important to me is that we work towards sustainability. At the moment, we have a big problem in environmental and economic systems, in global systems, with the pollution of oceans as a result of plastic waste, which is a huge problem. When I think about my children and my children's children, I don't want to have a feeling that they think I didn't care about this. I don't want to walk around blinkered, only thinking about my task, which is about promoting equality. We need to think broader. We need to have long-term aims. And to me, that means that if we're working in mixed teams, there'll be new perspectives on research, on science, and we can activate marginal areas. So my perspective looks beyond the garden fence. It's not just about promoting women or equality. The long-term perspective is what kind of society do we want in the future? And what global networks do we want? We will not be able to prevent globalization, even if there are some right-wing populisms that seek that. We're still dealing with the legacy of colonial policy. Why are refugees here in the first place? Why don't they stay in their home countries? We need to think about that. And that is something where I feel we need a lot more discussion with each other. And we must think beyond promoting equality to how we can shape a society with new or different values, apart from business case for putting women into management positions. I do think that in business there is some rethinking happening, at least that is my positive assumption. we have CSR, corporate social responsibility, and I think nowadays there is a bit of a new philosophy there. But the system itself, of course, is very rigid. And that's why it's so important for me that we continue to think about the system that we operate within, so that our very comfortable situation spreads around the world. And of course, the values that we have here, for example, women's rights, equality, can spread, so that we leave behind us a world that is worth living in. Indeed, the situation we have now, whereby some people are trying to turn the wheel back to the 1950s, has led to a lot of people now mobilizing. If you look at the Paris Agreement and the targets it set, one of which is women's empowerment, which leads to an improved ecology and better education for children and peace, because we know when women are supported, the world improves for everyone, including future generations. Can you say something now? Give us a few tips about how, in the future, let's say tomorrow, we can invest our energy so that this positive force pushes back the negativity. The only thing that I've been practicing for years and would only support is networking. Touch base with people who have a similar goal to me and look to see how we can bridge differences. I think that is a big secret, that it's not just about networking with people who share my opinion anyway. Of course, you need to do that, but also build bridges to people who think very differently on some issues, but nevertheless conduct an exchange and keep a flexible mind, an open mind, get to know other cultures. We talk about intercultural skills, but that means more than knowing when the public holidays are in different religions. I need to understand how people operate in different cultures. And the fundamental thing is always to have some understanding that people might be different, and to look not just, oh, what we do is fine, let's see what they do, but also to think, what can we improve? And move into exchange on that basis. And throughout my career, I've worked with a number of different types of partnership. For example, women at universities in Egypt. And seen that we had a lot of prejudices about each other, but were able to learn a great deal from each other because we entered into this exchange. Now, it can be hard work, and it means you have to constantly interrogate your own ideas and familiar traditions, cherished traditions indeed. But this is important. Networking, talking to other people, being open about what you hear, and taking those ideas out, taking your ideas out to other people. That's one way we have to restructure society. Think about how to improve it. My last question is about Berlin. In your work, what role does Berlin play? Berlin is the best city in the world. I always find it fascinating. I've been in Berlin for 10 years, and it's amazing how many different structures, opportunities, interesting people you can find here in this city, what this city facilitates. Berlin is constantly transforming itself, and that's what fascinates me. That's what I meant before. You have to network, you must get to know new people, you need to try out new things. And Berlin makes that possible. Against that background of its history, its divided history, its reunification, the urban opportunities you have here, because it's also centrally located within Europe, and there are so many new artistic initiatives that come together here. It was basically a derelict area after unification. So that transition process, that is central to everything that we need to do. We need to think in terms of transitions. We need to develop our society further. We need to work on changing things, but in a forward direction, not letting the wheel turn back to the 1950s and stick with it. This is a vibrant urban society here. And it's something that only Berlin offers with this amount of diversity and dynamism. It's growing so fast at the moment, and I have so much hope that Berlin will be a fantastic example, a laboratory for the development of future societies. Fantastic! Then thank you very much for your time and your work. Very happy to talk to you.